Welcome to today's lecture on evolution of slavery, some dimensions. Slavery as an institution has been defined as a form of property which gives to one person the right of ownership over another. Like any other means of production, slave thus becomes a commodity. Slavery involved a degree of domination-subordination relationship between persons which gave right to a master to force a slave to labor or render other services for the benefit of the master. Slavery was an institution that was fairly well developed in early India. With the advent of Islam, this institution also became legal. As has been pointed out by Irfan Habib, there were several factors that were responsible for perpetuation of slavery, and the most important one was that Islam accepted the status of slaves as legal with the understanding that the master was the owner of the slave, male or female, who could be gifted or sold. So, with this kind of an understanding, there was further expansion and ritualization of slavery, and it was also a belief that it was better for a person to marry a pure slave rather than an immodest free person. So, therefore, slavery also came to acquire some kind of a respectability, or rather a legitimacy. The Arabs were the first who introduced slaves as a commodity of trade, which helped them in growing their supremacy at international level. The international trade was carried on in such a way that the slaves were captured from India and they were exported to countries like Persia and Arabia, and this kind of gave rise to a new consumable trend of slavery. Slavery continued with an increasing trend during medieval period and therefore requires a detailed analysis. There are several contemporary accounts also which give us an idea about the prevalence of slavery and how it was evolving further. So, for example, Tuzuke Jahangiri mentioned that to punish the villagers and cultivators of Yamuna area, several inhabitants were slaughtered and their women and children were taken as prisoners and ultimately converted to slaves. And at Surat port, many people, in order to pay their revenue, they used to sell their children to the Europeans. Then there is the account of Pelsat, who says that the wives and children of the peasants who were unable to pay the full amount of the revenue were sold, and the reason was that was often quoted was the charge of a rebellion by the master and governors. Then another account is that of Manrik, who has mentioned that how in Bengal the governor or shikdars they used to exact the tax in advance, often by force, and when the poor people had no means of paying this, they used to capture their wives and children and then sold them in public market as slaves. So, this was the kind of trend that was emerging and became instrumental in further expansion of this institution. Then there is also mentioned that how such prisoners were carried off and attached to heavy iron chains to various markets and fairs to be sold. But at the same time, we also have a dichotomy for medieval period, especially for Sultanate period, because here we see that slaves were also emerging as nobles and rulers. In Delhi Sultanate, the nobility, who were an important part of the state, comprised largely of slaves who had very complex relationship of loyalty with individual rulers. Once their master or the ruler died, they had no attachment with the new ruler, and they often revolted against the new ruler. Then there was the struggle that was going on between the sultans and the nobles for power. One also sees a changing status during medieval period as far as the slaves were concerned. The economic status of the slaves during this period appears to have improved to some extent, and even Kautilya had mentioned that there was a provision of earning money through a slave in spare time, and this tradition of having little property right by slaves during Mauryan period continued thereafter. Some inscriptions that have been recovered from South India, known as Belur Taluka inscription, kind of instructs that if a man had no successors, then his property and land could very well be allotted to the child of the female slave. Then there are the authors of the period like Yajnavalkya, Medhatithi and Agni Puran also advocated in favor of some kind of ownership of property rights to the slaves. So, then another very important factor that we come across is that of rising elitism and the growing aristocratic life from Sultanate period onwards. Then the feudal economy and emergence of a rich landlord's class played a key role in both the strengthening of the slavery and the growth of the slave trade also. And the sound financial condition of the feudal masters kind of allowed them to retain slaves and to keep buying more and more slaves, which kind of became a status symbol. And there was an increasing use of female slaves also for pleasure among upper class. Now coming to the aspect of slave trade. Now, because there was so much supply of slaves due to several factors that have also already been discussed, so there was a possibility of handsome money and sufficient profit being earned through slave trade. Thousands of the people who were captured by the Arabs and the Turk invaders, they were regularly sold at high rates in the markets of Arabia. Then there was also the process of abduction of some forest tribes, which again resulted in a boost to the slave trade. The number of such abductions in fact became so high and the problem became so rampant that the state had to impose a ban on such abductions as was made by the Jain minister Tejpal of Gujarat. Now, there were some important barometers that were considered as important for fixing the price of a slave, like the physique, the beauty, the physical appearance, and also male and female slave. Knots and castrated boys served as private attendants in royal harems. Then Chatuspatha has served as it served as a regular place for the sale of slaves, as has been mentioned in several contemporary accounts. Now, this Chatuspatha was a kind of a public place where the slaves were on display and they could be bought and sold, and this was also to inform the common man about the sale, so whosoever was interested could come and acquire them. And there emerged several slave markets within India in areas like Kannauj, Gujarat, Malwa, Delhi, etc. In markets, the slaves from various parts of country were brought for sale as well as purchase, and these markets were also in a way attached with the international slave markets like Basra as well as Baghdad. So the slaves were imported as well as exported, and this also kind of boosted the state's economy. They were also exported to European countries, and there was great demand of Indian slaves in Arab countries as well. Then there were some professional slaves who were brought in from Turkestan, Khurasan, China and Malaya to India, and they were sold to the chieftains of various parts of the country. And in fact, Arabs were the first people who introduced the notion of treating slave as a commodity of exchange. So in the same way as the gold could be used as a commodity of exchange, slaves could also be used in a similar way. By making slaves as medium of exchange, Arabs developed their trade relations with East Africa. Through the trade of slaves, Arabs also tried to join various sea routes with each other, and the slave trade had developed as a profitable business, due to which the Arab traders successfully they kind of manipulated the international market, and they could also tilt the trade balance in their favor. So the slave trade played an instrumental role in boosting the economy of the period. Price of the slaves depended on age, sex and other personal qualities of the slave, and the price kind of ranged between 20 to 34 gold coins in several parts of the country, and the price of female slaves ranged from 20 to 40 tankas, in comparison from 5 to 12 tankas for an ordinary female slave. Now there are several sale deeds which kind of mention that how any kind of slave transaction has legality attached to it, and these sale deeds of slaves mention the day, tithi, year, name of the buyer as well as name of the persons who were offered the slaves for sale, along with the identifying marks. So the privileges of the owner as well as the tasks that were to be performed by the slaves at the master's house were also proclaimed publicly. Now these sale deeds were prepared in the presence of Panchakula, which kind of consisted of important functionaries like a Mahajan, then a Brahmana and others, with the mark of swastika. So this again gave a further kind of validation and legality to the whole process. Now coming to the aspect of female slaves and several categories. So these categories of female slaves depended on the nature of their works. So they were termed as Dhatri or Grihadasis or Pricharika or Yamachetis or Tambula Vahinis, etc. And Dhatris were appointed to nurture the children of their master's family, whereas Grihadasis, as the name suggests, were specifically kept for domestic services. Then there was a specific category of women slaves who used to carry water in the house for their masters, and they were known as Ghatadasis or Kumbhadasis. Apart from several domestic and personal duties, several women slaves were also deployed in agricultural work, and the term Paikah Sena suggests that women slaves were deputed as guards and were also assigned field duties, and sometimes they could also be commanders of units of the soldiers. Now the Yamacheti was designated as a woman who performed night guard duties, and Dwarpali reflects that this was a category of women who acted as guards of harem or antapur. Then there were some women slaves who were attached to the royal household as concubines, and they had to fulfill the sexual desires of their master as per their demands. And the masters of such female slaves were, however, forbidden from earning money through their deputation in prostitution. Then there were specific terms like avaruddha and bhujasya that were used for such girls who were used for this kind of a function. Now, there are several contemporary accounts which again give us an idea of the kind of tasks that were assigned. For example, Manuki has mentioned that sometimes the Faujdars committed excessive acts of oppression, which kind of resulted in a rebellion and resulted in warfare. So, whenever such a situation arose, the wives, daughters as well as the cattle of rebel villagers was captured, and the best looking girls were presented to the king, and the rest were distributed among the Faujdars, and some were sold. Then Moorcroft has also mentioned that how in Tiri and Garhwal the Raja was quite oppressive, and many people were compelled to desert their children and sell their women and children. Then another mention is that made by Hamilton, who visited India at the beginning of the 18th century, and he has mentioned that how at Thatta in Sindh he was kind of empowered to dispose of the families of the debtors by sale without going into any kind of a discussion or taking any kind of a permission from the authority. So, therefore, wars, debts and arrears were important reasons. However, they were not the only important reasons due to which women were enslaved. Famines and plague also forced the parents to sell their daughters as slaves to city-based rich people. And as has been mentioned by Wertheimer, if a woman of the noble family offended against the law of her sect, then the king had the authority to sell her off as a slave. And several times her relatives, in order to avoid disgrace and disrepute to the family's name, had the authority even to kill her. Now, one must also discuss the multiplying effect. The number and categories of slaves were multiplying due to several factors that we have discussed, like economic hardship, feudalization of economy, the production process, as well as the unstable political conditions, foreign invasions, etc. So, the Turk and Arab invaders, who mainly aimed at acquiring booty and money raising from the subjugated states, converted thousands of citizens into war captives who were sold as slaves in the markets of Basra and Baghdad at the rate between 2 to 10 dirhams. And as the captive people had lost their citizenship, they also lost their choice. The development of feudal economy resulted in further deprivation of their rights. Poverty was definitely a very important factor behind expansion of slavery, because the elite class had enough money and they could maintain and buy the slaves. Feudatories also attacked each other's territory in order to acquire the enemy's slaves so that they could earn money after selling them. So, slaves had definitely become a very important and a coveted kind of an possession, and the people who were abducted or purchased by feudal chiefs were deployed in several productive activities also in order to boost the economic and financial condition and the entire production process. As has already been mentioned earlier, that how Firoz Shah Tughlaq kind of started a number of karkhanas where several slaves were employed, and in fact the slaves were considered as the chattel economy, The rapidity in slavery tended the rising number of slaves as such a high rate that several contemporary thinkers have also mentioned this process. Now, a very interesting and insightful detail has been provided by Sunil Kumar about slavery during the Delhi Sultanate, and that is the presence of military slaves, which emerged as a distinguishing feature of the armies as well as the political systems of the Abbasid caliphs as well as the succeeding sultanates in Islamdom. The shared characteristics of all slaves as objects and commodities, socially dead as well as natally alienated, that lent them value as dependents engaged in military functions in Delhi Sultanates continued. Now, what was unique to Islamdom was that Delhi Sultanate qualified the Banda for tasks of military command as well as governance, and tasks that individuals of free status would have willingly performed but were often not trusted to perform. The tasks of slaves could extend to include the power to command and also forbid freemen. So, we see that there was some kind of a social inversion. Military slaves, at the behest of their master, often held command over freemen, and this is what Sunil Kumar has explained as social inversion. Some military slaves could be distinguished with more sensitive responsibilities and trusted with command over others. So, for example, Iltutmish, whose slaves had a large impact upon the political system of the Sultanate between 1210 to 36. Then there was an intervention in Sultanate politics which was not gained overnight by the Shamsi Bandagan. Senior military slaves possessed political power together with the ability to exercise it without constant supervision, especially in areas like Lakhnauti, Multan and Oach. Then age and method of acquisition also was the deciding factor. Some of the military slaves like Tajuddin Yalduz were purchased when they were extremely young, and others like Qutbuddin Aibak and Iltutmish were acquired as youths. So, all Bandagans went through a similar course of training before they were eventually raised up the ranks. The intention was to create new identities for the slaves, where their dependence upon their master was absolute, and the alienation of the slaves from his immediate surroundings and also absence of any kind of social contact with the older environment was crucial, and it helped in the settling down of slave in the new environment. The Sultan also ensured that his dependents from alien cultural background fitted well into their new socio-religious political surroundings. So, now arises, how was a sultan able to buy a slave's loyalty? So, in order to buy the loyalty of the slaves, there was of course the promise of wealth and higher office if one performed well in the service of the monarch. It helped to draw the contrast between the lives of the slaves in their former environment, when they were probably free, and as slaves in the service of the Sultan, where they were not free, but they had a more lavish lifestyle, they had power to enjoy, and they had privilege to to have an access to the monarch. So, soon there developed a symbiotic relationship, and the starting point to the position of trust and command for the Bandagan was an opportunity to personally serve the monarch, which was considered as something very prestigious. However, to reach to that level, the slave had to first display his personal worth and ability to impress the master. The master in turn was never missed a chance to show his affection towards the slave through kindness, through choicest rewards, gifts, etc. So soon these slaves, these bandagans, they emerged as foster sons, and the term that was used for such kind of training and upbringing was parvardan, that means to foster, and tarbiyat, which means to educate or nourish, to indicate the process through which slaves came to be regarded as foster sons. So this was again a very important change that could be seen in the institution of slavery, and it is in this background that we must understand the concept of bandagane khas, the commodification of the slave, his alien status in the local society, and the entire process of bonding through processes like parvarish and tarbiyat, then the rewards of increase in rank and responsibility. These were the factors which kind of distinguished the bandagane khas from the larger cadre of military slaves, who were of course not that crucial and that important, because their upbringing, their overall skill development, and also the emotional connect between the master and the slave was not to that level as it was for bandagane khas. So having discussed these various aspects of slavery, I hope greater clarity has emerged, and now we will think about this institution that was constantly evolving and changing along with the changing socio-economic and political context. Thank you.